He sat alone again. Same booth, same eggs, same limp. Most people didn't even look up when he walked in. Just an old man with a fading tattoo, maybe from some garage dare years ago. Until one night someone did look. A young soldier stopped mid-step, eyes wide, hand raised in a crisp salute. And in that one silent gesture, the entire diner and the world beyond realized they had been wrong. What followed wasn't just a tribute to one man, but to every forgotten hero who served without ever asking for recognition. A quiet veteran, a lost promise, a granddaughter he never knew he had, and a town that finally learned to listen. This isn't a story about war. It's a story about memory, kindness, and what it truly means to serve when no one is watching. That tattoo looks like something out of a cereal box. One of the men snorted, not bothering to lower his voice. His words cut through the noise of the diner like a slap, loud enough for everyone to hear. The old man didn't flinch, not even a blink. With hands that trembled, slightly but purposefully, he picked up his tray, steadied himself with a weathered cane, and began the slow walk toward the door. No words, no glance backward, just the sound of his cane tapping the linoleum and the soft rustle of his coat. To most people in that diner, he was just a frail, quiet old man who'd been asked to leave, someone they'd barely noticed until he was being ushered out. No one offered to help, no one stopped him. He simply became a part of the background again, until the Navy SEAL walked in. The moment the soldier stepped through the door, a strange hush fell over the room. Forks paused midair, coffee cups hovered inches from lips. Conversations dissolved into silence. He was young, sharply dressed in uniform, every movement crisp with discipline. And then he saw the old man. Without hesitation, the soldier raised his hand and saluted. A sharp, perfect gesture of respect that filled the room with a sudden, uncomfortable weight. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. This wasn't just some old man with a fading tattoo. This was someone important, someone worthy of honor. Walter Briggs had lived in the same quiet Kansas town for more than 40 years. To most folks, he was just the man sitting outside the faded garage on the corner of Main and Fowler, Briggs and Sons, though the Sons part of the sign had long since rusted into barely legible shadows. His life had grown quiet, small, predictable. But every day, Walter still rose early, polished his boots, and buttoned up the same olive green shirt he'd worn since his time in the Navy. It no longer fit like it used to, and it was older than most people in town. But it was his, and that meant something. Every Veterans Day morning, Walter made his way to the Fork and Skillet Diner, or rather limped. The breakfast special, eggs and toast for $1, wasn't the reason he came. He could have afforded more, but he didn't, because he wasn't there for himself. He came to honor someone else, someone who never got to eat that breakfast, someone whose name he never said aloud. The sound of his cane tapping across the floor, a horn, echoed faintly through the busy diner, each step slower than the last. His coat, an old brown thing a size too big, flapped gently with every movement. He made his way to the same booth he always chose, the one in the back facing the window where the morning sun poured in, casting a golden warmth across the table. That light fell on the faded tattoo on his left forearm, a dagger piercing an anchor, blurred and faded from years of sun and weather. He sat down with a low grunt, placing his tray down with care. Toast, eggs, black coffee. No sugar, no cream. Just behind him, a group of middle-aged men in polo shirts and worn jeans were talking and laughing too loud. One of them nudged another, nodding toward Walter. "Nice ink," he said, smirking. "What's that supposed to be? A pirate badge?" Another snickered. "He probably got it in someone's garage with a paperclip and a lighter." The third added, chuckling, "Betty says he tells people he's SEAL Team 6. Laughter followed, not mean-spirited in the way a bully might intend, but still biting, laced with a kind of ignorance that didn't need to be cruel to hurt. Walter didn't react. He never did. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon tapping rhythmically against the ceramic. A young server approached, barely 20, nervous, unsure. "Sir," she said gently, "would you mind moving to the outdoor seating area? Someone said your presence is making them uncomfortable." Walter met her eyes for the briefest second. There was something in his gaze, not resistance, not anger, just a depth, a kind of quiet weight she couldn't quite name. Then he nodded. Without a single word, he slid his tray across the table, gripped his cane, and pushed himself to his feet. Around him, no one looked up. No one said a thing. But behind him, someone muttered under their breath, if he was really in the military, he'd have medals or something, not just some tattoo. The door closed behind Walter with a soft chime. The silence didn't fall right away, but it would. The waitress, Kelsey, hadn't meant to be cruel. She was only 19, barely 2 weeks into the job, still figuring out the register, still learning who liked their eggs runny and who always asked for extra napkins. She'd just refilled the coffee pot when her manager pulled her aside. Ray, a stiff man with a clipped tone and a polished bald head that reflected the light like a warning. And that's when it all started to change. But that's another part of the story. His forehead was damp with nerves, and his collar was so stiff with starch it looked like it could cut glass. He leaned in toward her, awkward and uncomfortable, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you ask the gentleman at table 9 to move outside?" he muttered, eyes avoiding hers. Kelsey blinked, caught off guard. The man in question, Walter, sat quietly by the window, his back slightly hunched, his tray untouched in front of him. Ray, the older server behind the counter, shifted his eyes subtly toward Walter too. "Yeah, some folks are complaining. Said he smells like oil, that he makes the place look like a shelter," he added, voice low but clipped. Kelsey opened her mouth to protest, unsure what she even meant to say. But Ray cut her off. "He hasn't done anything," she managed, barely audible. "Just do it, please," Ray said, turning back toward the kitchen, already done with the conversation. "Be polite, we've got paying customers here." She stood frozen, fingers gripping the coffee pot like it was the only thing holding her upright. Her gut twisted. Every instinct she had screamed that this wasn't right. But this was her first real job, one she'd fought to get, and she wasn't in a place to lose it. With a breath she didn't realize she was holding, she walked toward Walter's booth. Morning light poured in through the diner windows, casting long shadows across the Formica table and falling gently over Walter's hands. His skin was worn, his knuckles scarred and weathered like old leather. He didn't look up as she approached. "Sir," she began softly. No movement, just a steady rise and fall of his chest. Her eyes drifted to his forearm, where a faded tattoo lived. An anchor entwined with a dagger, its colors long worn by time. It wasn't anything like the crisp, Instagram-ready tattoos her brother had gotten at the mall last summer. This one was different. This one had been earned. "I'm really sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My manager asked if you could move to the patio. There were complaints." Finally, Walter looked up. His eyes met hers. Time seemed to slow. They were the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, clouded with age, but soft. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. And beneath that tiredness, something else, something quieter, heavier. A weight she couldn't name pressed against her chest. He gave a faint nod. "No trouble," he said, his voice a gravelly hush. He reached slowly for his tray, sliding it toward himself with one hand. His other reached for the cane propped beside the booth. As he braced himself to stand, movement from behind Kelsey made her flinch. "Guess the wannabe's been relocated," someone muttered behind her, followed by a low chuckle. Another man snorted, taking a loud, sloppy sip of his drink. Laughter followed, careless, casual, the kind you hear in high school hallways when teachers aren't watching. It stung. Walter rose. He adjusted the tray, his movements practiced, but slow. As he turned, the rubber foot of his prosthetic leg caught the base of the table. A soft clank echoed through the room as the metal joint gave slightly. He paused, reset his stance. Then he moved, step by deliberate step. His limp was more visible now, more pronounced, but he never broke his stride. He kept moving forward. The bell over the diner door gave a faint chime as he exited. The glass swung shut behind him with a dull click. Outside, empty tables sat under a sky that was impossibly blue, too bright, too clear for the heaviness that now hung inside. Kelsey didn't move. She stood there a moment longer, gripping the coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. No one else said anything. No one got up. The clink of silverware picked up again. People returned to their eggs, their jokes, their lows, as if nothing had happened. And out there in the full glare of the Kansas sun sat Walter Briggs, veteran mechanic, ghost of a different time, alone with a trembling tray in his weathered hands. Before he was just the quiet old man at the diner, Walter Briggs had a different name, Ghost Line Bravo. It wasn't a name you'd find on any official roster. There were no plaques or medals attached to it, no stories told at parades. His role came without fanfare, but it was as vital as the men who made the headlines. Walter had served as part of a logistics support unit embedded deep with SEAL teams during the Vietnam War. They weren't the ones who kicked down doors or took enemy fire head-on. They were the shadows behind the mission, the hands that built the paths so others could walk them. It was 1970. The war had shifted into its most chaotic, bloodied years. Walter was 30 years old when he was dropped into the Annamite Mountains, a green canopy of danger stretching across the horizon. His mission, support Operation Lantern Trail, a classified rescue operation aimed at extracting American POWs rumored to be imprisoned in a restructured jungle compound near the Laos border. Walter wasn't the guy with a rifle. He was the one who mapped enemy patrols by hand, who marked silent drop zones in the soil with coded signals, who built radios from spare wires and gum wrappers, and who blinked flashlight codes into the dark when helicopters needed to land where no man had cleared a path. He remembered everything, every tree, every trail, every flicker of danger in the undergrowth. His brain worked like a machine, one built not for glory, but for survival. For others' survival. That mission would be his last. On the sixth day in the jungle, his team was repositioning to a secondary staging zone, and that was when it happened. Daryl Monroe, Walter's closest friend, the team's pointman, had only stepped inches off the marked trail when the explosion erupted, sudden, brutal, and without a hint of warning. One moment Daryl was walking right in front of him, and the next he was gone, vanished in a flash of fire and shrapnel. Walter was thrown backward, crashing nearly 20 feet away. The world spun above him, jungle leaves, broken branches, and sky merging into a whirling blur of pain, heat, and the shrill, endless ringing in his ears. When consciousness returned, all he felt was fire coursing through his leg. He looked down. His right calf was gone, shredded away by the blast. But what brought him fully back was not the pain. It was the screams, raw, desperate, close. The squad was scattered in the chaos. 2 men lay bleeding, one motionless and unconscious. The radio operator was alive, but his equipment was wrecked beyond use. The map that had guided them through unforgiving terrain was gone, taken by the explosion. But Walter hadn't forgotten it. The route, the fallback points, the coordinates, they were all committed to memory. Leaning back against a tree, a crude tourniquet cinched tight around his thigh, he took control. He gave out orders, clear, deliberate, telling the others to set up a perimeter to secure the wounded. His field radio was barely functional, but he coaxed out what little life was left in it, and with a broken mirror, he began signaling with a sequence of coded blinks, calm, steady, despite the blood seeping into the dirt below him. It took hours, but the rescue birds came. Every man wounded was lifted out alive. Every sensitive document was secured. Every trace of the mission erased, except for Daryl. Walter wouldn't allow it. He found what was left of his friend, cradled him, and dragged him through mud, ash, and tangled roots to the chopper. He didn't need help. He wouldn't ask for it. Daryl had gone in with him, and he would leave with him, no matter what shape he was in. Before that mission, before it all went sideways, Walter and Daryl had made a pact. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. They weren't men of many words. But in a quiet corner of Saigon, they'd sat down with a local artist by a fire and gotten the same tattoo inked into their arms. A dagger piercing through an anchor, angled slightly left. Not Navy issue, not for show. It was personal. Still beneath silence, Daryl had joked softly, grinning as the artist wiped the blood away. It was a vow that no matter what happened, they would carry each other's memory forward. Daryl didn't come back. Walter did, missing a piece of his leg, but not his loyalty, not his word. When he returned to American soil, there were no parades. His mission had been buried under layers of classification. No reporters, no medals pinned to his chest, no one even asked. The government handed him a prosthetic, a modest monthly check, and a bus ticket to Kansas. He opened a small garage, not flashy, not advertised, just a place where things got fixed. He taught local teens how to rebuild engines and carburetors, helped elderly neighbors mow their lawns when they got sick. He never talked about the war, never spoke of Daryl, but every year on November 11th, he made a quiet pilgrimage. A different diner each time, always one with a view. He'd take a seat near a window and order something simple. He never went for the discount. It wasn't about that. He didn't wear his medals or his uniform. He sat in silence, honoring a vow made long ago over a shared tattoo and the glow of firelight. One meal, between two friends, one present, one remembered. That tattoo, the one someone once sneered at, saying it looked like it came from a cereal box, had been etched in the middle of a war zone, under sweat and gunfire. It had survived sun, time, skin grafts, and decades of silence. It had never been meant to impress, only to endure, only to remind. The soft chime of the bell above the diner's door rang out as Lance Corporal Jeremy Ray stepped into the fork and skillet. He wore jeans and a black t-shirt, civilian enough, but the haircut gave him away. High and tight. Sharp posture too, disciplined, even when off duty. Home for a brief visit with his folks in the next county over, Jeremy had stopped in for some breakfast before heading out to see an old friend. The diner was alive with the comfort of Sunday morning, casual conversations, clinking silverware, country music low enough to fade into the background. Jeremy scanned for a place to sit, his senses finally relaxed after months on edge. That's when he saw it. Not the man's face, he could barely see that through the window, but the ink on his forearm, faded, worn by time, yet still clear to those who knew what to look for. A dagger through an anchor, slightly tilted left. It wasn't perfect, but that imperfection was its mark of authenticity. It wasn't made in a shop. It was scorched into the flesh by fire, war, and the hands of men who had seen too much and spoken too little. Jeremy froze. His heart stumbled. In a flash, he was back at SEAL Prep in Coronado, final week, just before graduation. They were given case files, anonymous ones, stories about veterans whose names never made the news. Ghosts, heroes no one cheered for. Quiet giants who carried missions and memories in their bones. One story had stuck with him more than the rest, a legend the instructors called Ghostline Bravo. Jeremy had heard the stories before. A logistics NCO during Operation Cinderpoint had done the impossible. When a landmine shattered the unit's comms and nearly ended the mission, this man had memorized extraction maps and hand-signaled coordinates under fire, saving 6 men. No name, no photo. Just whispers of a man who pulled it off with one leg, a shattered radio, in the grit of a ghost. The only clue, an old tattoo, a dagger through an anchor. Only 2 men ever wore it. Jeremy's body moved before he knew why. He stepped back out onto the gravel, boots crunching softly beneath him. Wind tugged at a napkin under a plate, and the old man, Walter, reached out to keep it from blowing away. That's when Jeremy saw it. The tattoo. Clearer now, more than just ink. It stirred something inside him. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. Walter looked up slowly. His face gave away nothing. Jeremy's throat tightened. He nodded toward the mark. Were you part of Operation Cinderpoint?" Walter blinked at the name like it was a door creaking open in the back of his mind. His mouth parted slightly. No words came out. His eyes locked with Jeremy's, studying him. Then faintly, just once, he nodded. Jeremy felt his spine straighten on instinct. Shoulders back, feet together. He hadn't worn his uniform today, but every inch of his training rose to the surface, because this wasn't just a stranger in a diner. This man was legend. Jeremy Ray brought his right hand to his brow in a sharp, clean salute, one born of reverence, not rank. Right there on the worn concrete patio, just beyond the diner window. Inside, the clinking of forks stopped. Chairs groaned softly. Conversations froze mid-sentence as heads turned toward the window. Walter Briggs sat silent, stunned. His mouth trembled as if trying to form words that couldn't find breath. His left hand curled slightly over the tray beside his plate, holding something invisible. Maybe it was memory, maybe loss. Jeremy didn't drop the salute. His voice rang out through the cracked diner window, loud enough for all to hear. "This man," he said, "is not just a veteran. He's a part of our training history." More heads turned. The men who had jeered earlier sat in tight-jawed silence, their laughter long gone. Jeremy lowered the salute, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words fell with the weight of reverence and steel. "We don't train on fairy tales and SEAL prep. We don't worship movie heroes. We learn about quiet operators, the ones who made impossible missions happen and never talked about it." He turned, eyes sweeping the room. "One of those stories," he continued, "was about a logistics officer in Vietnam. Operation Cinder Point. A man who saved 6 wounded brothers after a landmine took out half the unit, and the only radio? No evac, no backup. He memorized the terrain, hand-signaled extraction using flashes, improvised code. They called him Ghost Line Bravo. No name, just a shadow, just a story." Jeremy turned and pointed gently toward Walter. "That story ends here." The silence inside thickened. Diners rose slowly to their feet. An elderly couple stood from their booth. The man nodded, solemn. A young mother wiped tears from her eyes. Near the counter, the waitress who'd asked Walter to move now stood frozen, coffee pot shaking faintly in her hand. Walter shifted in his chair, gripping the table's edge like he needed it to hold more than just his balance. Jeremy's voice softened, but it hit just as hard. That tattoo, the dagger through the anchor. It wasn't for show. It wasn't fashion. Only 2 men ever wore it. One of them never made it home. The other, he gestured toward Walter, still keeps watch. Walter had been coming back every year, quietly, faithfully, trying to honor a memory that time had nearly swallowed. Sitting alone, he didn't ask for attention or thanks. He only wanted a moment of peace to remember someone who mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and worn thin, like gravel dragged over time. "I didn't do anything special." Jeremy, standing tall in his Navy uniform, shook his head slowly. "With all due respect, sir, you did what most wouldn't. You kept coming, even after the questions stopped." Inside the diner, an older couple, their faces softened by years, began to clap gently. It wasn't loud or flashy. Others joined in, not instantly, but gradually, as if unsure at first whether this moment deserved celebration or silence. What unfolded was something far more meaningful than applause. It was recognition, solemn, understated, and deeply felt. Even the loud men in the back, who earlier mocked from the shadows, went silent. Their arrogance dissolved, leaving only the discomfort of shame. One of them stood, his shoulders low, and quietly walked out the door. No words, just the sound of retreat. Jeremy turned back to Walter, his voice filled with weight and warmth. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. The kind of honor that makes this uniform worth wearing." Walter didn't respond right away. His throat tightened, and his eyes glistened, not with pride, but with something quieter, something sacred. After a moment, he looked up at Jeremy and whispered, "Thank you, son. That's more than I ever expected." In that quiet instant, the world seemed to shift ever so slightly back into alignment, as if, just this once, silence had spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. The clapping died down, giving way to a kind of hush that felt holy. Walter sat still, hands weathered by time folded gently in his lap. His food untouched, tray pushed aside. No one was looking at his grease-stained coat anymore. No one heard the faint creak of his prosthetic leg when he moved. Instead, something deeper had caught their attention. A collective stillness, like the room had suddenly remembered what dignity feels like, what sacrifice costs, what silence really says. Then from the edge of the scene came the soft, uncertain steps of someone approaching. Kelsey, the young waitress, clutched a steaming pot of coffee like a shield, trying to steady herself as she walked toward him. Her face was flushed, and shame weighed heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't quite meet Walter's eyes. The patio was quieter now, but her earlier words still echoed in her mind. The ones she had been told to say, the ones that had asked him to leave. She cleared her throat. Would you like a fresh cup?" Her voice was thin, almost breaking. Walter looked up at her. There was no anger in his eyes, just quiet patience. a kind of gentleness that held no judgment, only curiosity. Her hands trembled as she poured the coffee. "I didn't know," she said. I didn't see you." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Most people don't." I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she added, then paused. "And I think I know who you are." That caught his attention. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. She glanced around, then leaned in a bit closer. Her voice dropped, tender and careful. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. My mom never really talked about him. He died before I was born. But I remember his name, Daryl Monroe." Walter's heart skipped. His hand hovered above the cup, now shaking gently. "Daryl Monroe," he repeated softly, like a prayer, like a ghost finally speaking. Kelsey nodded, blinking fast to stay composed. "They said he died on a secret mission. We never got the details. Just that he was brave, that he saved lives." Walter reached into the deep pocket of his old coat. His fingers moved past old receipts and crumpled napkins until they found what he always carried on Veterans Day. A photograph creased at the corners, edges softened by time. The ink faded, but the image still clear. Two young men in jungle fatigues, arms over each other's shoulders. One of them, unmistakably a younger Walter, lean, smiling, eyes bright with youth. The other, Daryl Monroe. Kelsey gasped. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my grandpa." Walter's hand trembled as he offered her the photo. "He saved my life." She stared at the photo, then slowly looked up. This time she really saw him. Not just a customer, not just an old man. He was part of her story, part of her family, a living bridge to someone she'd only ever known through silence. Without a word, she set the coffee pot down and stepped closer. Walter rose to his feet, slowly, forgetting his cane for a moment. And then, Kelsey wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rehearsed, just a simple, deeply human hug. Quiet, meaningful. A connection between two people who had lost something and unexpectedly found a piece of it again. Inside the diner, people watched from their tables and through the windows. Some wiped their eyes, others just sat in stillness, their hearts full. Jeremy stood nearby, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his respect unmistakable. Because some stories don't need medals or parades. Some stories just find their way home. By Monday morning, the entire town of Haven Ridge was humming with the same quiet awe. A single photo had captured what words never could. Jeremy Ray, young and straight-backed in uniform, saluting the frail figure of Walter Briggs. The early sun had caught Walter's lined face just right, softening the sharp shadows and revealing the faded tattoo on his forearm, subtle but unmistakable. There was no pose, no filters, no hashtags, just reverence. By noon, that image had made its way onto the front page of the Haven Ridge Tribune, framed under a bold, simple headline, "A Salute to Silence." No need to explain. The veteran everyone had seen, but never truly noticed, was suddenly being seen by the world. It spread faster than anyone expected. Local morning shows gave it airtime. Then came the state channels. Then blogs and message boards dedicated to military families picked it up like wildfire. By Friday, folks were driving in from 2-3 counties over. Not for the famous hash or fresh-baked biscuits at the Fork and Skillet, but for the man behind the story. Walter Briggs didn't shift with the attention. He still rose at 5 every morning, still placed the same worn boots by the front door, still limped, slow but steady, through town and into the diner every Thursday. But now, the booth by the window in the back was never taken. It belonged to him. No one had to say it. It wasn't formality. It was respect. Ray, the diner manager who once grumbled to a waitress to move Walter outside, was the first to put it into writing. One afternoon, once the post-breakfast lull settled in, he walked over to Walter's booth carrying a plaque made of deep walnut. They'd had it custom-made by a local woodworker. At the center, carved with precise care, was the dagger through the anchor, Walter's tattoo, engraved as though it had always belonged there. Below it, a brass strip read simply, "Reserved for Walter Briggs, steel beneath silence." Walter didn't say much when they showed it to him. He just nodded, knocked his knuckle against the wood once. "Feels heavier than it looks," he said under his breath. But the next Thursday, he came back. Walter didn't change. What changed was everyone else. Veterans who had kept their stories buried deep began to surface. Quiet men and women who had long blended into the edges of Haven Ridge began walking toward that booth. Not for answers, but for understanding. Walter didn't give speeches. He never raised his voice. He listened, really listened. Some brought faded photos. Others handed over medals their own families didn't even know they had. Some unfolded letters they'd written but never sent. Walter listened to them all, like a blacksmith working worn metal back into shape, using only coffee and silence as tools. Over time, he became more than a man. He became permission. Permission to remember, to mourn, to flinch at fireworks without shame, to limp without explanation, to confess that July heat still felt like jungle nights that wouldn't end. The diner evolved with him. Kelsey, now one of the most requested servers, added her own quiet tribute. Above Walter's plaque, she installed a small glass shadow box. Inside was a photo Walter had kept for decades. He and Daryl Monroe, shoulder to shoulder. Beside it, a neatly folded flag and a hand-lettered card that read, "For the ones who never told their stories." A chalkboard appeared beside it, updated every Monday with quotes from visiting veterans. Kelsey made it her weekly ritual to choose one. Walter had a favorite. Some of us never got medals. Some of us never wanted them. But we all needed to be remembered. Even local high schools began inviting Walter to speak. He never spoke about himself, not once. But he always carried Daryl's photo, told stories about sacrifice, quiet courage, and friendships forged in fire. Not all heroes wear perfect uniforms, he would say. Some wear scars you can't see. After one talk, a teenager raised a hand and asked if the tattoo was real. Walter smiled softly, the kind that lives behind the eyes, as real as the men who wore it. Jeremy Ray returned once before his next deployment. They didn't talk much, just shared an hour of black coffee, side by side in silence. When Jeremy left, he tucked something under Walter's napkin, a single patch from his unit, neatly folded, no words exchanged. By winter, Haven Ridge had changed in ways no one could have predicted. But Walter? He stayed the same. Still came alone, still paid for his coffee, still nodded with quiet solidarity to every veteran who walked in, whether they wore dress blues or worn denim. The world had finally seen him, but more importantly, it had finally started listening. Walter Briggs never sought attention. Even as the town changed around him, he never once asked for a platform. But somehow, just by sitting still, he became one. The sudden attention brought a flicker of a smile to his face now and then. But most days, Walter simply melted back into the rhythm of the life he had always known. Quiet, humble, and full of quiet purpose. Every Thursday morning, without fail, he showed up at the same diner, always choosing the booth by the window. He ordered the same simple breakfast. Black coffee, eggs over easy. Nothing extravagant, never anything more than what he needed. And every single time, he tipped Kelsey $1 more than the total on the bill. On slow mornings, when the place was nearly empty and sunlight spilled lazily across the checkered floor, Kelsey would slide into the booth across from him. They didn't talk much, but when they did, she always listened intently. Sometimes he'd tell a story about Daryl, always Daryl, or what it was like to fix engine belts deep in the jungle during monsoon season. His stories were vivid, the kind that made you feel like you could smell the oil and hear the rain pelting the tin roofs. In the afternoons, he would reopen the small garage behind his house, not for profit, not to bring in business. Just to help, that's what he did. That's who he was. He showed local teenagers how to check their oil, patiently walking them through each step. He helped new fathers troubleshoot weird engine noises, always crouching beside them with a flashlight and quiet encouragement. When they offered to pay, he always brushed them off with a grunt. "Just bring me a coffee next time," he'd say, already turning back to his tools. He never once brought up the plaque hanging inside the diner. Never pointed out the yellowing news article framed on the wall near the door. But every Thursday, before he sat down, he'd run his fingers gently along the edge of the booth, like it was a sacred spot, a place where memory and duty met in silence. 3 years passed this way, then... On Veterans Day, Walter didn't come. Kelsey waited until noon before something told her to go check. She walked the 2 short blocks to his small white house. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside and found him in his armchair, facing the window. A book rested lightly in his lap. Tucked in the pocket of his flannel shirt was the same old photo of Daryl Monroe. He looked peaceful, still, as if he had just drifted into the light, right where he belonged. News spread faster than anyone expected. It was as though the whole town had lost a brother, a father, a trusted hand. Grief moved like wind through Haven Ridge. Veterans came from 5 counties, some in dusty old trucks, others in polished dress uniforms that still fit. For the first time in a decade, the diner closed its doors. A line stretched outside the small white chapel even before the sun crested the trees. Then from the East Road came the unmistakable sound of heavy engines. 6 black SUVs rolled slowly into town. Out stepped a team of active-duty Navy SEALs dressed in full ceremonial uniform. Leading them was Jeremy Ray, now a lieutenant. He held the folded flag in both hands, eyes straight ahead, jaw clenched with emotion. They didn't ask. They simply insisted on carrying Walter's casket themselves. No one stopped them. No one would. The chapel was packed wall to wall. Locals, veterans, students, young families, all people Walter had helped in one way or another. Some brought old photos of rusted carburetors he had repaired. Others brought letters he had written after visiting their classrooms. And some didn't carry anything at all. They just stood quietly in the back, hand over heart, not entirely sure why they were crying. But they did cry. And at the graveside, as sunlight broke through the clouds and danced across the soft grass, Jeremy stepped forward. In his hand was a small plaque, which he gently placed beside Walter's headstone. It bore the same symbol carved into polished steel, a dagger through an anchor. And beneath it, just 2 simple lines. Walter Briggs. His silence saved lives. Then came the final salute. The honor guard raised their rifles. The shots rang out, echoing through the trees. And then, stillness. No one moved, not for a full minute, because in that quiet moment, beneath the rustle of leaves and breeze through the grass, it was as if Walter was still there. As if he were watching, reminding them all that true strength, real, lasting strength, often lives in the quietest of men. Service doesn't always come with medals or microphones or parades. Sometimes it comes quietly. A steady presence, a kind gesture, a promise kept. But its impact can stretch through generations. Walter Briggs never marched in ceremonies. He never told stories about what he had done, but with a fading tattoo on his forearm, a simple breakfast routine, and the quiet dignity in how he carried himself, he reminded one town, and later a nation, what real honor looks like. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't ask for praise. All he wanted was to remember a friend, to keep a promise, to do what was right, even when no one was watching. And that is the kind of service we so often miss. There are people like Walter all around us, men and women whose names we may never know, people whose stories go untold. They carry invisible burdens with a quiet kind of grace. There's the neighbor who still wears his boots every day, even though his knees ache with each step. The nurse at the VA hospital who's never missed a shift, but you did shift, though she never once talks about the war zone she once walked through. The janitor with the limp who never explains where it came from. These are the silent veterans, the forgotten helpers, the ones who never asked to be seen but absolutely should be. And maybe, just maybe, one of them lives right next door. Someone like Walter, someone whose quiet presence masks a history deeper than most would ever guess. You might not have noticed him at first, just another older man sitting silently in the corner of a diner, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. But then something small, a faded tattoo peeking from under his sleeve, caught the light, and suddenly everything shifted. Because once you know his story, you don't just see Walter differently, you see everyone differently. There's power in moments like that, quiet power, the kind that sneaks up on you and lingers. Maybe it reminded you of someone in your life, someone whose strength was quiet, whose battles were invisible, whose love was steady but unspoken. Maybe it cracked something open inside you. If that happened to you while watching this, don't let that feeling fade. Write that name in the comments. Let their story live again. Tell us what changed you. Give voice to the quiet heroes who walked among us unnoticed. And if you are someone like Walter, if this world has looked past you more times than you can count, we want you to know, we see you now, we honor your journey, and we thank you deeply. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it made you think twice about someone you've overlooked, or brought to mind someone you carry with you always, please consider giving this video a like, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the most profound moments in life rarely shout. They whisper, in the silence of a meal, in the touch of an old scar, in the voice of a soldier who simply says, I just came to remember a friend. Thank you for being here, and thank you for remembering.